Hello, Brain Damaged Philosopher here. Since I started this channel, I've mainly been focusing on producing videos in various series on epistemology and ethics to spin out my particular views on those subfields of philosophy and my systems. However, some very dense and difficult topics in my ethics are going to be coming up pretty soon. And I think it might be a fun time to take a break and do something a little different that might be of interest to a more general audience who don't know me personally. In this case, I'm going to actually be covering the philosophy of a well-known philosopher, John Rawls, and my problems with it. Because I think that's something that might be of interest to more people, since there isn't a lot of content on him on YouTube, and it's not something that you'd have to be interested specifically in me to be interested in. Since I'm at the point right now in my quote-unquote career where to be interested in what I have to say on things, you really have to be interested in me. So why did I choose John Rawls? Well, his philosophy has a couple of interesting features that are sort of fun to deal with and think about because they impinge on game theory, decision theory, and economics, which are some things that I'm somewhat interested in. And because his approach to ethics is pretty unusual, and he's what I call a crunchy thinker, a thinker that tries to justify what he's saying in very interesting ways, even if he ultimately fails, without relying directly on intuition or flowery words. Another interesting crunchy thinker is Nozick, for instance, which is interesting because they both knew each other and were actually part of the same philosophical club. Also, John Rawls is someone that my ethical philosophy class covered recently, and of course I've been aware of him for a long time before the ethical philosophy class. In fact, I've written at least 2 essays on John Rawls' philosophy before, but he's fresh on my mind, so I think it might be interesting to talk about him. Before I talk about my problems with his philosophy, however, I think it might be best if I cover what his philosophy actually is. So, to begin with, I'm going to be focusing mostly on Rawls' theory of justice, since that's what he's most famous for, and that's what I know the most about from him. So, there are actually a couple interesting features just in how he understands what justice is and defines it that I think I should start with. So, normally, philosophers conceive of justice as something that is supposed to govern the moral judgments and ultimately the actions of individuals. So, justice is supposed to tell you whether an action is just or unjust, and therefore should be pursued or not pursued. And justice also can many times specify the punishments or recompenses due for unjust actions, and sometimes, although rarely, the benefits or rewards that are due just actions. And so, even though most philosophers try to justify their conceptions of justice differently, and most philosophers come to different conceptions of the content of what justice is, they usually agree that that is what justice is. Generally, when the concept of justice is applied to groups or institutions, it is as an aggregation of what the philosopher considers just on the individual level, perhaps with a few changes. Rawls is different, however. Rawls believes that the most interesting, or perhaps the only, thing that justice is supposed to apply to is the principles and goals that institutions should have. And justice only applies to individuals incidentally, in as much as the individual is a special case of an institution. So he essentially sets the whole thing on its head. The second interesting thing is that while most philosophers view justice as something that can either be derived from the general intuitions of a person, this is the ethical intuitionist or moral subjectivist view, or moral relativist view in some cases as well, or they view justice as something that can be derived from abstract rationality or universalizability or the nature of us, of creatures or the world or something like that. Rawls views justice as something that can be derived from an agreement between people. So instead of justice being something that is uncovered by a philosopher, that is a fact about something that the philosopher uncovers, or justice being something that is just chosen at whim by, the individual, Rawls believes that justice arises not as some truth or a true proposition about things, but instead arises in the agreement between people right there. It does not exist before, it does not exist outside, it only exists after and in. In this sense, he's a contractarian. He believes that justice and ethics arises from the agreement between rational people. And this last part is actually where things start to get interesting, because then we get into Rawls' conception of justice as fairness. Essentially, he believes that any principles for institutions, which is what justice is, principles for institutions, chosen by rationally self-interested actors under conditions of fairness, must necessarily themselves be just, because anything arrived at fairly and that is representative of at least the abstract interests of everyone must be just. Now, this is understandable. I'm not sure that he provides a very good justification of this, but it's intuitively understandable. However, what he does next is even more interesting. Essentially, what he says is that as thinkers, it's often hard to actually be fair in the way that his process of fairness that leads to justice requires. And so, instead of trying to simply come up with principles for institutions that directly satisfy things like universalizability and, general interest, we should instead attempt to imagine what other people besides ourselves who cannot possibly be anything other than fair would do. And so this is what he calls the original position. Essentially, if you take actors, if you take, people, rational people who are competent to make decisions, and put them behind the veil of ignorance by removing all of their specific knowledge about themselves, not just their skills and station in life and class, but also their knowledge about their own moral views. If you take all of that away from them, and thereby put them behind the veil of ignorance, and then behind the veil of ignorance put them in the original position, and then ask them to arrive at principles for the institutions of the society that they're supposed to live in, that they can all agree on, then that satisfies a process of fairness that could lead to just principles. And so if we imagine that, it's easier to leave aside our biases because we're imagining other people. And so essentially, he puts a few interesting requirements on this veil of ignorance, though. I think you've already noticed one. Not only do you not know anything about yourself, specifically about where you're supposed to be in the society and what your skills are and so on, which makes sense to remove any sense of bias. He also says that actors behind the veil of ignorance are supposed to not know anything about their own moral views. This is interesting because it means that it is impossible for actors to select on any criteria besides material self-interest or economic self-interest, because any view about what is good in life besides pure economic interest impinges on the moral and so thus would be removed from these actors. And he says this explicitly, that these actors must select purely on economic self-interest. The other thing one might note that's interesting about this is that this original position only really requires one actor, if you think about it. Because if all of these actors are purely rational, and they also know of no differences between any of them, and they could end up anywhere in the society that they select, then they'll agree to or disagree to different principles for the exact reasons that all the others will. And so there's no difference between the judgments of any of them, and so you can get rid of all but one. And Rawls mentions this as well, but he seems to prefer to think of it as a group choice, even though what he's actually, by extension, thinking of in the original position is really just what one rational actor would choose. And so he says that behind the original position, if they knew nothing about themselves, and therefore wouldn't want to bias the principles of the institutions and the society that they're supposed to live in towards anyone, because they might end up in the group that they're biased away from, just as easily as the one they're biased towards, they would select two principles. The first principle says that every person should have an equal liberty compatible with the equal liberty of everyone else in the society. This makes sense because liberty, freedom of action, is very important to being able to have a good life, even in a sort of economic sense. And no one would want to limit freedoms more than they had to, because there's no abstract self-interested reason to do so. And no one would want to give anyone more or less liberty based on membership in some group, because you might end up in the group that has less liberty just as easily as in the one that had more. Now, there are arguments to be made against this principle, but I'll get into those later. Then the second principle is called the difference principle, and that has two components. The first says that any social or economic inequality generated by this society should only be allowed if it benefits the worst off in society. So if I gain an extra $2 more than my neighbor, then the poorest person in my neighborhood, if we're saying that the principle is only applied to the neighborhood, should get at least $1 as a result somehow. The second part of the difference principle says that any station in society that might grant differential social or economic benefits should be open to all. What this exactly means is unclear to me, as I'll get into later, but we'll leave that aside again. Now, importantly, Rawls stresses multiple times that the lexical ordering of these two principles is very important, because it means that no one can have unequal liberty, even if it would benefit the poorest off in society. So we must have equal liberty first, and then we figure out what to do about social and economic inequality. Okay, so on to my problems with this. The first one is that right off the bat, Rawls is essentially trying to borrow unearned authority, because whatever principles that he selects, it's impossible to actually think like an actor behind the veil of ignorance in the original position, because that person would be psychologically incapacitated. They wouldn't be able to function because they would know far too little about themselves. If they didn't even know what skill they had, then obviously they couldn't use that skill. So they wouldn't be able to know what skill they had in thinking. So how could they think? Because obviously that would indicate to them how good they are at thinking. And if they didn't know what they considered good, it would be difficult to even motivate them to care about economic outcomes. And so the fact that a person in the original position is psychologically destroyed means that it's a false hope that you can ever attempt to think like someone in that hypothetical position, leaving aside the fact that you might think that you're thinking like that person and actually be taken by your biases without realizing it, since that's the whole reason that cognitive biases are so insidious in the first place. And so what this means is that Rawls is trying to say, oh, well, a perfectly fair, perfectly self-interested person would agree to these principles that I've constructed, and so obviously they must be good principles. But he has no way of knowing if a perfectly fair, perfectly rationally self-interested person would actually agree to them. He just thinks they would, and because he came up with a hypothetical, he just gets to say that they would without any real reason for it. Now, he actually does try to give reasons, however. And so let's get into the problems with those. So first of all, he says that for the difference principle, the reason that a rationally self-interested actor would select a principle like that is because they would want to follow the maximin principle, which is essentially the idea of choosing the option that out of all that has the least worst, the least bad, worst outcome. So if I have option A, B, and C, right? And option A has a very big possible payoff, but a really terrible possible loss. And option B has an okay possible gain and an okay possible loss. And then option C has almost a non-existent possible gain, but an almost non-existent possible loss either. A rational agent in the original position should choose the third option. So, essentially he says that they would because they would use this maximin principle because since they did not know the relative probabilities of each of the outcomes, so in this case, they wouldn't know how likely they would be to be, rich or poor or middle class or whatever. They would want to ensure that even the worst off outcome isn't too bad. The problem with this, though, is that there's no reason to think that a perfectly rational and economically self-interested actor in the original position would actually think like that, would actually be that risk averse. Because it seems equally likely that a rational actor might try to go for maximum possible gain. Nothing risked, nothing gained, and accept a society that might lead to, huge inequalities where they could end up at either end of the spectrum. Because that's essentially the reverse of what Rawls is saying, right? He's saying that they would try to maximize the worst outcome. Why not maximize the best outcome, right? And then the other possibility, right, is that the actors might say that, okay, well, I don't know the relative probabilities of each outcome for this choice of principles. However, since I don't know, the natural starting assumption is that they're equally probable. That's just how statistics works. And so they should weight each possible outcome for that set of principles equally, and then multiply those weights by the value of that outcome, right? So it would be, if there are three possible outcomes, rich, middle class, and poor, and the first is $100 and the second is $10 and the third is -10 or something like that. I'm not really sure. Utils, let's say, instead of dollars. And then you'd multiply each by 0.33333, add them all up, and then see what the expected return is. And then select the option that has the highest expected return. That actually is the default way that game theoretic and economic actors choose things in most theory. And so actually that one, just by default, should be far more likely than what Rawls suggests with the super risk-averse rational actors. The other thing that they might do is say, okay, well, I don't want to end up too badly off, but, I want to see if I can also maximize the possible gain I can make. So maybe they would not put a cap on possible inequality on the high end, but they would put a lower baseline on on how bad things can get on the bottom, so that even if they don't make it to the very high height that they're risking a slightly lower bad outcome to get, they wouldn't end up too unhappy. So that would be like, an extremely libertarian society just with a UBI. There's all kinds of other options that are just as plausible to choose. And they all lead to completely different societies, right? Actually, in fact, one of them specifically goes totally against what Rawls would want, which is the utilitarian option. Because a rational actor could say, well, maybe what I want to do is choose a principle that, instead of specifying outcomes beforehand, just says, well, we should try to maximize the utility of the society that we end up in. And yes, this might end up pretty bad for me, but it might mean that, or it will definitely mean that the average happiness of the society will be much higher, because that's sort of the goal of optimizing the overall happiness of society. And so I'll have a much higher chance of being happy, and of being happier, and a fairly good chance of doing pretty well, even if there's a tiny chance that I might do poorly. And Rawls really doesn't like utilitarianism, so that might be he might consider that a bad outcome, but it's certainly possible. Additionally, there are other problems. For one, the fact that Rawls arrives at his principles of justice through a hypothetical contract instead of an actual contract is a severe problem, because why should we necessarily care whether a set of principles is fair if nobody actually agreed to them? We are normally inclined to care about fairness, but if fairness actually leads to a society that actual people, not psychologically hobbled by the veil of ignorance, dislike for moral reasons or, aesthetic reasons or whatever, why should we place fairness as the chief of our interests when it actually isn't? Why should we let it dictate all the other values we have? At best, what Rawls suggests is a system of principles that we should view as a goal, not as something that is automatically and by default binding. Because usually when someone says, oh, well, if everyone in this agreement, in this room, that while we're agreeing on this contract, were perfectly rational and reasoning correctly, they would agree to X, but instead they've agreed to Y. That doesn't mean that X automatically becomes binding on everyone, because no one actually agreed to it, because no one's perfectly rational. It just means that we could wish for X and hope that, eventually we might get to X. Because what a perfectly rational person would do has no binding weight on what just your average normal person would actually, should actually do, necessarily. Especially when that perfectly rational person that we're thinking about is, again, completely removed from the actual other values besides economic self-interest and fairness that real people have. There are also a few other problems that I have with Rawls's philosophy, of justice at least. For instance, when he talks about equal liberties for all compatible with the equal liberties of everyone else, why isn't freedom of association and freedom of property included in those? Or why aren't? Because if you think about it, if everyone has an equal liberty to own or equal freedom to own property, then that means that everyone should be able to own as much property as they are able to voluntarily acquire from everyone else. To place a cap or a tax on those who have too much property is to say that some people have less of a right or a freedom to own property than others do. Likewise, for freedom of association, if one has the total freedom of association compatible with the similar freedom for others, they should be able to associate with whomever voluntarily wants to associate with them. And that means that the second part of the difference principle would be nullified, because some people might not want to accept some person for a certain position, even if it grants social or economic benefits, simply because they don't want to. And to say that they cannot simply because their association would grant those benefits is to say that they have less choice over whom they associate with than other people whose associations don't bring with them similar benefits. This seems to sort of contradict the lexical order that Rawls stresses so much in his principles. Now, sometimes in a few statements of those principles, Rawls puts in parentheses personal next to the freedom to own property. But this is just an ad hoc exception. And how do you truly define personal property? Is my computer, for instance, a means of production or simply a personal possession? It's a good question, isn't it? So he's essentially just making an ad hoc or post hoc extra stipulation in order to make these seem not to contradict, but they do. Additionally, there's no reason why actors behind the original position would not be able to assess the relative probabilities of ending in any echelon of society, since he stipulates that although they don't have knowledge about themselves, they can have general knowledge about the world and how things work. For instance, in most capitalist societies, the truly destitutely poor make up a few percentages of the population. And so a perfectly rational actor might well make the decision, aside from the possible payoffs, that it's worth it to accept this tiny, single-digit risk of being pretty unhappy in exchange for all of these great benefits, both on the high end and in between, a higher average benefit. And that could play into, the risk calculation option that I said was the most natural alternative to the maximum and actually the default in game theory. There are other problems too. Being forbidden a more complex understanding of their own good means that it automatically rules out all sorts of possible societies that could be generated from principles behind the original position. Because if the actors behind the original position were allowed to have a more complex idea of what is good besides just basic liberty and money, essentially, they might realize, they might all become conservatives and say, well, actually, being independent and relying on oneself is far better than, living high on the hog. And so they would actually rather a set of principles that doesn't allocate welfare to the poor, even if that might mean that they end up materially destitute. It seems arbitrary and rather self-serving that Rawls would artificially say that they could have no conception of their own good besides material. And this gets into my main criticism with Rawls, which is that he seems to sneak his desired conclusions into the hypothetical itself. He wants society to focus on allocating social and material wealth, and so he eliminates the actors from thinking about anything other than social and material wealth. He wants the society to be purely based on helping the poor as much as possible. So he artificially and pretty much reasonlessly says that the actors will be as risk-averse as possible. And importantly, he also wants the society to have a distributive sense of justice, and this is not Ozek's primary objection, instead of a historical sense of justice. And so he automatically makes it so that the actors behind the original position must view property as a great lump sum granted to the whole of society that can be allocated, instead of being able to specify a rule such that those who earn their property receive it, or even be aware of who who accrued that property and how it got there. Yeah, so in the end, while Rawls's approach is somewhat interesting, it essentially begins by begging the question, and then fails to even justify why we should care that he begged the question in that way. And even if we allow for some of his, many of his premises that seemingly beg the question, it can still lead to principles for society far different from his own. Importantly, too, even if we say that Rawls only meant to say that this is a system that we should aspire to, right, to get around the problem of why we should care about what rational actors think, that doesn't solve the problem that we might have other values. And so, in the end, there's not really much to really chew on here once you've deconstructed the philosophical apparatus, complicated though it is, that he's built up around this system.